without further ado, let's welcome Charlie Colbourn, who's going to speak to us on locating interactions, separation, and constraints.
I am not going to use a microphone. Is that okay with everyone? Do I need to talk louder? Do I need to talk less loud? This is a blue screen. It's meant to make you look at the rest of the view. Well, while they're putting this up, which I hope they're doing, let me say a few words. So first of all, thank you to Yao Meng, to Hengjia, to Anmao, to Violet, to all of you for coming. I'm amazed and very happy. I'm always happy to come to Singapore. Alex was saying to me last night that we were in Singapore together in 1986, and I thought, was that the first time I was in Singapore? And it turns out I was in Singapore in 1983 at a conference at NUS, and I thought, I don't have very clear recollection of the academic part of that conference, even though I remember Singapore very well. And I thought, I must have given a talk there. And I went to look to see what talk I gave, and it was a paper with Doug Stinson on critical sets and Latin squares. So I have a long history of coming to Singapore. I love the place, I love the people here, and Yao Meng has been an incredible host so many times I can't even count. So anyway, there will be lots of time for reminiscences about Singapore and about other places. So I should try to keep us on time and get to the talk. So what I'm going to do today is tell you at a fairly high level some directions on locating interactions in experiments. So this is joint work with more people than I could possibly list, so I listed a few of them at the bottom here. It's work that's supported by the National Science Foundation and also by this strange logo here. Is this a pointer? Yes. This is the Software Test and Analysis Center of the US Navy. They have become quite interested in testing applications using combinatorial tools, so I've been very pleased to work with them. Okay, so let me set the framework for what it is we're talking about. We have a complex system, an environment in which there are many different factors that may affect the performance or the correctness of this system. So to model this, we imagine that there's some set called here script F of factors that may affect the result. For each factor, we identify a fixed number of levels or values that the factor could take on. And what we're concerned about is how these factors affect some experimental performance, or how they interact to affect that. So the situation that we're most interested in is that we're looking at T-way interactions. So what's a T-way interaction? Pick any T of the factors. For each factor, pick one of the possible values for that factor. So you've got T factors, a level for each factor. We'll call that a T-way interaction, and sometimes we say that it has strength T. So what's a test then? A test is a way to set all K of the factors to one of the possible levels. And a test suite is just a collection of tests. And so we often write this as a n by k array, where every row corresponds to a test, every column corresponds to one of the factors, and the entry in a specified row and column is the value to which that factor is set for that test. So the usual experimental setup that we're after is that we execute these tests. So we use these to configure a system. And every time we run a test, it may pass or fail. Of course, more generally, if there are numerical responses, it may be the case that it exceeds a threshold or does not exceed a threshold. So we may still classify a binary outcome even for continuous type responses. And our interest is to understand how interactions affect the system. So we make the assumption that if there's an interaction that affects this way the system behaves, then it involves some number S of value for each of the T corresponding factors. Look at each of the rows and see whether in the specified columns you find the specified values. If the answer is yes, we say that that interaction appears in that test or appears in that row, sometimes is covered by that test or is covered by that row. And this notation here, row of T, says this is a set of rows in which the interaction T appears. Okay? So, for many years, people have been looking at these objects called covering arrays. And what is a covering array? Well, a covering array of string T is just an array in which every single T-way interaction is covered by some row. And one way to write that is to say that this row of T, is that row of T is not empty for every T-way interaction T. Okay? So there's a huge literature on covering array construction, and there are people talking about covering arrays here. I'm going to be focusing on something else. I'm going to be looking at the question, how do we find the interactions that have caused a fall or caused an unusual behavior change? So a covering array alone is enough to tell you that there is a fault if you run all of the tests in the covering array, provided that faults are never undone by other interactions, never masked by other interactions. But the question that's asked here is, can we actually find the faults? So some of you may have seen this before, but I'm going to go through it quickly just to make sure we have the idea straight. Here's a small covering array. So it has 5 factors. It has 5 factors. It has 6 tests. And you can see that each test indicates how all 5 factors are set. This is a covering array on 2 symbols, obviously. But it's also a covering array of strength 2. So pick any 2 columns you like and check. You should see each of the 2 times 2, 4 possibilities in that pair of columns. But I'm interested in this question. Suppose I tell you that when I run these tests, the results I get are fail, pass, pass. And I want to know who's responsible for that fault, or those faults. Maybe there are more than one. So I want to know who's to blame. So the first thing I might think of doing is I might say, well, maybe one of the factors by itself is to blame. So let's see if we can check that. Well, let's just look at what test 2 tells me. Test 2 passed. So that means that if factor 1 is set to level 1, that can't possibly be causing a fault. Otherwise, that test would have failed. So because of that, I can go through test 2 and say, because it passed, these values for the corresponding factors definitely must be okay. They cannot be causing the fault. Well, but we've got 4 tests that passed here. 2, 4, 5, and 6. So if in addition to doing this for test 2, we do it for test 4, 5, and 6, you see that every single way to set a single factor to a value does not cause a fault. So we haven't found what caused the fault. Well, now we're going to check for pairs. Okay, so there's, if I choose to, 10 different pairs of columns that we can choose. And I can go through and I can say, well, for each of the tests that passed, that indicates that certain pairs must not cause the fault. And so you see a whole bunch of check marks here that indicate that none of these things that have check marks could be the interaction that caused the fault. But look at these other entries where it says 1 or 1, 3 or 3. Those interactions have the property that that's the set of rows in which they appear, but that's the only rows in which they appear. So if rows 1 and 3, tests 1 and 3 fail, we won't be able to tell whether this or 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 this, whether any of those are okay. So all of those are possible faults, candidate faults. Now, if you were to tell me that the result is that 1 and 3 fail, and you told me in addition that there is only one fault, I know what it is. It's that one. Because that's the only one that can cause rows 1 and 3 to fail, and nobody else. But imagine now that I told you row 1 fails, but row 3 passes. And now you suddenly go, well, is it this one, or 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 this one? We can't tell. And so testing with covering arrays tells us we can tell whether or not there's a fault. But where is it? So locating arrays are designed to address this question of how to identify where the faults are. So what I'm going to do now is, imagine you've got a whole set of interactions. Then just look at the set of rows that contain at least one of them. Well, one way to write that is that row of a set of interactions is just a union of the rows in which each individual one appears. And the problem we're faced with is that we're told the set of rows that failed, and we want to go backwards to say, this is what the set of interactions was that caused that failure. So, how can we guarantee to be able to do that? Well, imagine you've got 2 different sets. If those 2 sets of interactions appear in exactly the same set of rows, each containing at most D T-way interactions, and if they appear in the same set of rows, that must happen if and only if they're the same set of interactions. So if you take 2 different sets, they must appear in different rows. Some variations that have been looked at here, you notice that I had this D bar notation. I could modify things and say exactly D instead of at most D. If I did that, I would use this notation. D means exactly D, D bar means at most D. Same, I could talk about interactions of strength T or at most T. And so there's a number of different variations of this. And unlike covering arrays that have been studied cause of failure, and if at the end you are left with a set of candidate faults, unfortunately for locating arrays, there may still be candidates remaining that are not actually faulty. What you would like is you would like to be able to just go through that process and at the end say, and everyone else who hasn't been declared to be okay is necessarily faulty. And that notion is captured in a related object called a detecting array. So a detecting array is defined somewhat similarly. take a set of at most d t-way interactions and any other t-way interaction. What we're asking here is that if I look at the rows that contain any one of these d t-way interactions, I want to see that I can tell whether or not t, the other one, a single one, whether or not it's faulty. And the way I can do that is by asking that it appear in the row, in some row, that none of these appear in. And that's precisely what this says. Some of you in different language will be used to thinking of locating arrays as a union-free condition and thinking of detecting arrays as a cover-free condition. And that's exactly the right analog to think about here. So I want to say a little bit about how to construct locating and detecting arrays, and then say a little bit about extensions. So for covering arrays, most of the work that's been done has been on strength 2. There is work on larger strength, but roughly speaking, as the strength increases, the amount of work done on it decreases. And you might say, well, why did it start at strength 2? Why not start at strength 1? And you think about this for 1 second and you go, well, but if I just choose tests so that every value for every factor appears in some test, that's trivial to do that. And so covering arrays of strength 1 are of no interest. For locating and detecting arrays, their story really does start at strength 1. So I actually have to thank Bing Lee. He came into my office one day and he said, I was telling him we should come up with some constructions for strength 2 locating arrays, and he said to me, what about strength 1? And I looked at him like he was from outer space, thinking, how could anybody think strength 1 would be interesting? And then I realized that actually for locating and detecting arrays, the story really does start with strength 1. And so I'll just tell you quickly one case where Daniel and Bing Lee and I came up with an explicit formula that tells you exactly what the size is of a locating array, and in fact gives an algorithm for the construction. So this is just a sum of a number of binomial coefficients, and there's a very natural construction that goes with it. This is the kind of result we would like to get for larger strings, something that tells us explicitly, here's how big it is, here's how to construct it. So the reason I wanted to show this to you is not so that you actually work through all the details, but so that you kind of see what the target is or what we would like to be able to produce. Even when you go to detecting arrays, strength 1, the problem is still open. Recently, Yanshin Chang, Zhengling Zhou, Daniel Horsley, and I have been working on this problem, and we have some improvements on some earlier work by, I guess by Brett, by Lucia, and by Karen. Yeah, Mark. So the exact determination of the sizes is still far from complete, but this is a very interesting problem where coming at it from one direction develops Sperner partition systems. Coming at it from another direction, it turned out that these are really detecting arrays with strength 1. So, how am I doing on time? 5 minutes, okay. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about actually constructing arrays, because we've been trying to use these in applications, and one of the difficulties we've been having is that finding good constructions for them for general situations has been somewhat difficult. So we've been looking at taking probabilistic methods and using them to develop algorithms. So I want to tell you a little bit about what happens there. So if you want to make something, a natural way to make it is choose a random one, check it. Okay? Doesn't sound too clever, but it works remarkably well in a lot of problems, especially if you don't know too much about exactly what you're able to produce by combinatorial geometric techniques. So So what's the idea here? Choose an n by k array with all the entries chosen at random, and then try and assess what's the probability that it is a locating or detecting array of the desired type. And so what we need to think about is how are we going to calculate that probability? Well, what I want to do is I want to take this large compound event of it being a locating array and break it down into a number of small events. So for locating arrays, the events I will look at is just identify the pair of sets of interactions that must appear in different rows. And then we can say that pair corresponds to a good event for this array that we've chosen if those two sets of interactions appear in different sets of rows. And it's a bad event if they appear in the same set of rows. Okay? For detecting arrays, you can do the same thing, but now instead of two sets of interactions, it's one set of interactions and another interaction. Okay? And we're asking, in that case, we're saying it's good if that single interaction appears in some row that none of the interactions in the set script T appear in, and it's bad otherwise. So then we're asking a slightly different question. Instead of saying what's the probability that this is a locating or detecting array, we're asking the question, what's the probability that there's no bad event? And one way to answer that question is to say, is the expected number of bad events less than 1? So I'm just manipulating the question at this point. I'm not asking a different question. I'm just manipulating the question to be able to get at it. Well, now, for each event, it's quite easy to calculate the probability that that event will be good. So because of that, I can assume that all the events have an arbitrary dependence among them and just sum up the probabilities, the probability for each event that it's bad, and that will give me the expected number of bad events. So the standard probabilistic method now can be applied, and we can determine very easily whether this array, or with what probability this array will have an expected number of bad events less than 1. And of course, the natural observation is, if it's less than 1, and it's a non-negative integer, it's 0. And that's what we're after. So, a lot of improvements result by saying, you assumed arbitrary dependence among the events, but in fact, some events are independent of other events. Can't you exploit that? And the answer is yes, you can. So in fact, the Lovász-Volta lemma applies here. But one of the things that's interesting for people who have used this in covering array land or hash families or a number of different contexts is that the most natural application of Lovász-Volta lemma here actually uses the asymmetric version, not the symmetric version, because events, depending on their structure, have different probabilities of being good and bad. So you can extract a result here from symmetric Lovász-Volta lemma, but you can improve it somewhat by using asymmetric Lovász-Volta lemma, which is kind of striking. So this idea that you've got a standard probabilistic method and you've got a Lovász-Volta lemma suggests algorithms. And so let me just outline two algorithms that appear to be fairly effective. So in 2010, Moser and Tardish showed that there's a deterministic analog of the Lovász-Volta lemma. Sometimes people just call it the deterministic Lovász-Volta lemma. And when you translate it into this setting, it turns out to be a very easy method to construct arrays of the type you want. So what's the idea here? Choose a random n by k array. Now, before what I would have done is I would have just checked it to see whether or not it's a locating array. And if it wasn't, I would have said no, throw it away. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to run through all of the events, and we're going to check, is this event good or bad for this array? If it's good, we keep going. If it's bad, we stop and say, which columns, which factors are involved in this bad event? Resample all of them. In every row, every column involved in that bad event, resample it, and now go back to the beginning and start checking the array again. And what Moser and Carter showed is that if you have a number of rows that's equal to the bound that the lowest local lemma tells you, that this method, simple method, is expected to run in polynomial time. Not guaranteed to. Of course, you might make a very, very bad initial selection, but it's expected to run in polynomial time. So, in fact, what we've observed is that in most cases, if we pick the number of rows equal to the value from the lowest local lemma, the number of iterations we're seeing on average to correct it, the number of resamplings we're seeing on average to correct it is 2. 2. So this is a very, very effective algorithm, but what's even more interesting for me is that I can take this same method now and say, what if I gave it fewer rows? Not enough for the lowest local lemma to guarantee that there's a solution. And it continues to work remarkably well. Now, of course, the number of resampling starts to climb. We've run some cases where we've allowed it to do 10 million resamplings. But this turns out to be a surprisingly effective algorithm for making, locating, and detecting arrays.
Polynomial, is that polynomial in the number of events?
No. Yes, polynomial in the size of the sample space. So yeah, polynomial in the number of events.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's only going to be useful if you fix the strength, fix the number of symbols, and let the number of factors go to infinity. Then you will get a truly polynomial time algorithm. But if you say, I want to let the strength increase as well, you will not get what I would call a polynomial time algorithm. Exactly. So some variations you can do on this. Everybody has the resistance that really you encounter this one bad event and you just throw away a huge amount of the matrix. And I mean, maybe one little repair would fix it. Why are you going so crazy? Well, one version of this that appears to work quite well is to say, pick one of the columns and just replace that. And a version of that that appears to work even better is always replace the last column in the bad event. And if you do that, of course, now you lose some of the guarantees of how it's going to run. But what happens is that you get whole chunks of the matrix that never change. And this becomes a way of just adding columns, adding factors to an existing array. The standard probabilistic method actually gives you another sort of approach that builds one row at a time. And I'm not going to be saying too much about this, but the basic idea is that I start off with an array that has no rows at all, has lots of bad events, right? I start building here and there. I want them to be different. And what this definition says is, I want them to differ in at least delta rows, okay? So usual definition would just say they have to differ in at least one, but now we can say they have to differ in at least delta. The point here is that if I run these and delta minus one of them give me an answer or give me no answer, then I am still able to see a witness to the difference between these two sets. And for detecting arrays, exactly the same thing. In locating arrays, of course, the delta differences that we're asking for could be either direction, right? Could have this one but not this one, or this one but not this one. In the detecting arrays, it has to be where that interaction T appears, but nothing in the set script T appears. So it's a one-way difference in this case. And the variations all go through here very naturally. But what's kind of interesting is that when you ask the question, I apologize, okay? for putting up such a big table and asking me to read it at this point in the talk. So this very interesting scenery outside, if you don't want to look at this, but rather than spending too much time apologizing for it, I should explain that this is a part of a table that goes on for many screens, and you're only going to see one of them. So I may be bad for putting up so many numbers, but I could have put up a lot more. So what's going on here? Well, let me just pick one of these rows and say something about it. So let's look at this 2 to the 100 row. So what that means is 100 binary factors. And what we're building here is a 1-2 locating or 1-2 detecting array. So a single two-way interaction to locate it or detect it. And these things are all numbers of rows. So here you see that for delta equals 1, there's 2 different methods. The 34 row solution comes from very simple column resampling. Okay, so the Moser-Tarbush type approach. The 31 is a much more sophisticated local optimization technique that tries to remove as many rows as it can. So these are, obviously 31 is better than 34, but it's not dramatically different. The Moser-Tarbush type approach appears to do fairly well compared to something that invests a lot more computation time. But now look at what happens when you ask for a separation of 2. Of course, if I can do a separation of 1 in 34 rows, I can do a separation of 2 in 68 rows. Just take every row twice. And it's very hard to guess how much of an increase should you expect to see. But what you notice here is that it's a very modest increase, 34 to 39. Delta equal 3 up to 46, delta equal 4 up to 53. So asking for separation appears to be a very natural thing to do. So one thing I do actually want to apologize for is that over the years, many people have asked me, why don't people look at covering arrays with higher lambda? Right? Seems like a very natural thing to do. And I've said, I don't really see any reason to look at covering arrays with higher lambda. But actually, the analog here really is looking at covering arrays with higher lambda. And it makes perfect sense. The thing that's striking here is that the probabilistic results and the probabilistic algorithm seem to say that the increase is quite modest. And for detecting arrays, you can see that these are quite a bit larger. But again, you see a fairly modest increase. Now, I want to say a little bit about can these be dealt with in the probabilistic methods? And the answer is yes. So you can, for a particular delta now, ask the question, what's the probability that it is good in at least the delta rows? This is a very natural way to proceed if delta is 2 or delta is 3 or something like that. But a much more natural way to get at this is to think of it in the following way. Think about a particular row. Think about a particular event. You can calculate the probability that that event is good in that row. And now, if I have capital N rows, how many rows do I expect that event to be good in? Well, it's exactly the probability that it's good times the number of rows. So it's just 5 times n. But in fact, something much more than that is true. This is a binomial process. This is a binomial distribution. The number of rows in which it's good is a binomial distribution. So now, what is it that we're asking for? We could, instead of saying, what's the probability that it's at least 2, or at least 3, or at least 4, we could say, what's the probability that it's very close to the mean, very close to the expectation? Because if the expectation is that on average, they are good 5 times, and I say it's at least half the expectation, it's going to have to be good at least 3 times to be good at least half of 5 times. And so there are a lot of results on what are called concentration inequalities to say how close things are expected to be to the mean. And in particular, for this problem, you can get very good results by using Chernoff inequalities. There's also Hoofding and Azuma inequalities that are more sophisticated, give you slightly better results, but even fairly simple Chernoff inequalities here will give you sufficiently good probabilistic estimate that you can continue to get both log k growth rate on the number of rows needed, no matter how tight you ask to be concentrated around close to the mean, but you also get all the algorithm consequences. So what about where this leaves us? Well, sadly, towards the end especially, I started wandering off into asymptotic land. And one of the things that's striking is that for covering arrays, locating arrays, detecting arrays, the connection between the asymptotic techniques and the algorithmic techniques is sufficiently strong that it's very useful. But once I start getting into this, using Chernoff bounds and that kind of asymptotics, I've now opened this gap where I need things to be quite large, larger than is realistic for practical applications. So I don't want to say to you, oh, so we've just solved a whole bunch of problems. Actually, we found a direction to solve some problems, but I don't think this is really, I think that some of the practical nature of this is disappearing, although it's still pointing us in the right direction. It says that we should be able to come very close to balanced in general, at least asymptotic. So what might we do to make these things better? Well, one of the directions I think is very important, very interesting direction to follow is the idea that if I'm going to use probabilistic techniques and I'm trying to get a better result, actually Brett was very involved in the idea of just do a sample space reduction for covering arrays to try and get better probabilistic estimates. Well, there have been some results recently that use geometric or algebraic structure to reduce the sample space quite dramatically, and this has been very effective for covering arrays. We don't see how to do it yet for locating or detecting arrays, but I'm not going to say anything more about that because I think Aaron is going to be talking about that a bit later. And the question that I really haven't said anything about, but it's kind of a motivating question for the whole thing, is how can we use these ideas of separation and constraints to actually make real-world experimentation more accurate, and in particular to recover the significant interactions. And Violet's going to be talking more about that, so I'm not going to say anything about that. Now, if I've planned this right, then I am going to push next, and nothing's going to happen. Okay? And that should mean that the talk is over. So it worked. So thank you very much.
So are there questions for Charlie?
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me is you're talking about, yes, the asymptotics were great, but you can't create these small, usable ones. And I, in the project, just encountered exactly the same thing in group testing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
We were looking at whether group testing could help us make diagnostic tests for incoming first-year students to determine which math skills they're missing.
Yep.
And we did a big literature review and we found all sorts of papers that said, oh yes, you could get the optimal group test. And none of them worked for the kind of small scales we were interested in. It's a real gap in literature.
I agree. This is a fundamental problem that we have a lot of very beautiful combinatorial, geometric, algebraic, finite field type constructions for things, and if one of those works, it's spectacular. But then you deviate from that and you say, okay, I need something. I know what the conditions are, and if it's large enough, you can start to use asymptotic techniques. But quite often, so I think what's interesting here is that the probabilistic, the asymptotic techniques really do work for smaller cases. But then I was falling into the trap of, oh, well now I'll enforce this condition, and then I can use these kinds of bounds, and I still get the right kind of algorithms and the right kind of performance. But it's an illusion, because if I tell you I want separation 30, for example, then if I'm down into the regime of a small number of factors, it's going to be 30 times as big. That's the truth.
Yeah.
And there's nothing I can do about that, right? So the asymptotic's telling me that, oh no, you can have a separation of 30 and there's essentially no cost for it. That's telling me something in a range of values that's really of little interest to me.
Yeah.
So I think that this whole intermediate range of it's big enough that you should get some benefit from it, but not so big that you can just have the asymptotics wash it out. I think that's a really interesting range to be looking at things.
Yeah,
But
we're looking at like a handful of